Hello and welcome to Costumer Confidential. This is where you get a sneak peek behind the scenes at the Pickering Museum Village and in our costume collection. So today I thought we'd talk a little bit about corsets, because when people come to visit us at the village, one of the things they always ask is, are you wearing a corset? Which is rather a personal question to ask a lady, but anyway, they do ask. And they also want to know, how do we work in a corset? Isn't it terribly uncomfortable? I'm going to dispel a few myths about corsets and just give you a couple little fun tidbits. First of all, corsets did change a little bit over time, and just to give you an idea, in the 18th century, a corset looked more like this. So there's a look at the corset. These are called actually jumps, and they're quite long, right down to the hip bone, and they would have had. Usually they had a busk of wood down the front in the early days, and then of course it went to the lacing. And usually they were boned with, at this time, usually whalebone was what was used, or sometimes reeds were used to stiffen the corset. And the idea of this was to support the bosom and to give some shape to the garment itself. And at this time the shape was very conical. Your body just kind of went like from here down to the waist like this, very conical and very cylindrical was the idea. So that's why the jumps are the shape that they are. As we go further into now, from the 1700s into the 1800s, we work with a much smaller set of jumps, as they were called. They got very much smaller. They almost look like a modern bra, but they did give a lot of support to the bosom, and they were able to give that almost shelf-like look to the Regency fashions. So then, of course, they got longer again, then going into the 1830s. And then we get into this kind of shape here, which is the type of shape that is most typical of the corsets of the time. Now this one here, this black one, this one is a mid-century corset, and as you can see, it has this is typical now from the mid-century onwards. It has the grommets down the front with it's a busk fastening system, and so what happens is the lacing is at the back. That's where the lacing happens. And so you lace it loosely, and then what happens is you have to do up all these little bits. Now, one of the things we say with corsets is you always put your shoes on before you put a corset on, because once you have this on, you can't bend down to put your shoes on. We've had a few cases where people have gotten completely dressed and then realized they haven't got their shoes on, and then someone has to actually do it for them. So it's always the adage is shoes before corset. So the other thing you have to remember when you're getting into a corset is you can't do it quickly, because when you're trying to do these up, you can either go from the top down or the bottom up, but the most difficult one is the one that's right under the bust that you can't actually see very well and that you have to get into place. So this cannot be done quickly. You have to be in a sort of a zen moment to put your corset on. The other thing to remember about corsets is you have to remember which side is up. So a little trick that we use at the museum, this is my own personal corset, is we often put little bows or ribbons at the top so that if you are in a hurry trying to get dressed for an event, you will know which side of your corset is up, so that you don't have to actually change it up when you realize you've done the wrong thing. So that's a little trick that you can do for costuming. Now, corsets for the most part, this one here, I'm just going to show you, just turn this around. This one here is laced as tight as this because this is the only way it actually fits on this Judy. So normally when you're wearing a corset, there's always a gap of about 2 to 3 inches of the laces. It's never usually done up as tight as this. And so that's something to keep in mind. And this particular one features something that was very typical as we get further into the 19th century, which is it has a bust gusset here. So that it actually forms a nicer line to the bust. And when you see something like this on, you can see it's got quite a lot of, the edge here is quite firm. So you'd always have your chemise on underneath your corset, but you'd also have to wear a corset cover over top of the corset. And the reason for that is you don't want the bones of the corset rubbing against your fine fabric of your dress. So the corset cover would cover it up, and then that way, there's no rubbing of the corset. Now, if you were a person of means, of course, your corset, this is a very straightforward cotton corset. Most of them were made of just a very finely woven, very tightly woven cotton. Sometimes coutil is used, very often coutil is used. But as you get further into the century, and if you're a person of means, you might put a very pretty fabric on the top layer. The bottom layer would still be that cotton drill, which is, you need that because you need the security of the cotton that's going to really hold everything in. But they would often put a beautiful brocade or a beautiful fabric on the top. And then, of course, the decoration on the top would be this lovely ruched ribbon, which would be very pretty. So this is very typical also. And even though no one ever sees it, you know that you're wearing it, and it makes you feel really good. So this corset here is one that we use for demonstrations. It's a fairly big one, so it's kind of a one-size-fits-all. And so we use this so that people can see what it's like to put a corset on. And of course, we just let them try it on over their clothing because we don't want to make anybody feel weird. So, you know, it's just done up, and then this would have to be like completely unlaced to be able to, you know, put this on somebody, and then you tighten up the laces. Now, the interesting thing about the idea of one size fits all is it doesn't really work with a corset. And do we all wear corsets? Well, no. First of all, the problem is you have to have a fair bit of budget to be able to put everybody in a corset because it isn't one size fits all. A corset is a very personal garment. It can only be worn by one person. And what happens over time, as you can probably see a little bit with mine, is it kind of molds to your figure, and it doesn't really fit anybody else because it's actually sort of molded to the curves of your figure, so then it would be very strange to put that on someone else. It's also kind of a personal garment. And so at this point in time at PMV, those of us who have been around a long time, we all have corsets and we love them. The one thing about a corset that is fantastic is there's no straps bugging you on the top, and it keeps you very upright. Your back feels wonderful at the end of a long day when you're cooking over a wood stove or a hearth. Your back feels great because you haven't been doing a lot of back bending. If you drop something on the floor, you essentially have to do a little bit of a plie to go down, pick it up, and come back up again because you have to keep that upright position. We love wearing them because they feel comfortable to us. We do not, you know, there's none of this Scarlett O'Hara thing where people are yanking on the strings and making it look like it's incredibly tight. Yes, people did do that, but we don't. We just wear it as the average person in the 19th century would have worn it, which is comfortably. And it supports everything it has to support, and strangely enough, any jiggle or muffin top that you may have magically disappears. We don't know where it goes, but somehow you just get this beautiful cylindrical figure, and it gives the right shape to the costuming, which is why you really want to wear it, you know. People thought nothing of wearing corsets, but little girls were started off in a type of a corset from an early age, and it was just part of their clothing, and they just wore it. There was no complaining or saying, oh, what about this corset? There was some discussion about corsetry in the late 19th century, and they came up with a sort of a natural form dress that did not involve wearing a corset. But most women would be scandalized by that because they were so used to wearing corsets, it was part of their underwear, and they would never have gone out of the house without one. In the early 1900s, a new type of corset came along called an S-bend. Now that corset is a little uncomfortable, I have to say, because what it does is it makes your body form almost an S shape. It thrusts your back out, and your chest comes forward and gives almost like they used to call it a powder pigeon look. The S-bend corset goes right down over the hip, and so your hips are somewhat confined as well. So yes, that one's a little bit harder to deal with because to sit in that one is a little bit awkward. One of our volunteers has an S-bend corset that she's made, and she said, yeah, she prefers her mid-century corset to that one. Now at that time, early 1900s, the new innovation with corsets too was they were putting suspenders on the corset leg so that you could attach your stockings to your corset. Up until then, you were still attaching your stockings, like you would pull them up and you'd put a garter around them, and that's how you kept your stockings up. But early 1900s, the S-bend corset gave us a new innovation. So when you get further into the 19-teens and into the 20s, what starts to appear is, with the 1920s being a much more skimpy kind of a dress, the first modern brassiere was born at that point. And really at that time it was two pieces, triangles of silk usually just tied together. And that's how they dealt with it. No corsets at that point. That was part of the 1920s. Woo! Anything goes, was they got rid of their corsets. But if you remember your grandmother and great-grandmother, I bet she had a corset, but she called it a girdle. And that was to keep everything in and to keep your shape really nice and to support you. And really, that's what corsets are all about. They're about support. So don't be afraid to try one on. Thanks. And stay tuned for our next little costume confidential.